Hello, my name is Benjamin Kingston.
My name is Joseph Mora.
And we represent Regis Mora Kingston, arguing in favor of the petitioners.
Why is social media so important today?
Social media is so important today because it gives people the opportunity to both express their opinion to millions of people, as well as see the opinions of millions of others who are on these platforms. With millions of people possessing technology to access such social media platforms, it's extremely important that everyone is able to express their opinions without interference from the platforms.
In addition, the fact that millions of people, as my partner said, are in social media, the fact is that these social media accounts and platforms now have essentially a monopoly on these views. Essentially, if these social media platforms like Twitter, Meta, X, all these new platforms decide to censor someone based off their political speech, then they have no other recourse to actually express their political speech. Because social media is now essentially the primary method of communication online. So essentially, these social media companies have a large monopoly over the free speech of Americans online.
And social media is extremely important because, as my partner just mentioned, it's essentially the public square of today, right? So everyone is able to express their views to many people sheerly through social media. Considering how our world is becoming increasingly digitalized, it's extremely important that we treat social media platforms that are meant to carry speech of the American people. We should treat them just the same as how we should treat engaging in speech with another person, and thus the speech on social media should have the same protection.
How does the Florida law restrict social media platforms' ability to engage in content moderation by removing, editing, or arranging user-generated content?
So essentially what the Florida law does is that it tells these social media companies that no, you cannot ban or remove users' content based off of their political views. Thus, these social media accounts would not be able to remove them based off of their opinion on political topics.
Now, this is bolstered by the individualized explanation requirements that this law enforces. What it's doing is it's making sure that social media isn't just banning anyone for whatever reason it pleases, or just an ambiguous reason that could very well be viewpoint discrimination. And the intentions are clear here because it doesn't require an individualized explanation for anything that's obscene. So it's not preventing social media platforms from adequately preventing anything illegal or vulgar on their sites, more so preventing them from just limiting the expression of people on their platforms without any real reason, and doing so, it prevents social media platforms from discriminating against people based on their viewpoints, because they have to provide an actual reason to ban a post without it just being the viewpoint.
In addition, the whole point of social media law in Florida is to ensure that social media remains an open platform for all Americans, and Americans' First Amendment rights are protected under even under these social media platforms, because essentially social media is becoming the new public square, as we mentioned in the other question.
How does the Florida law require social media platforms to provide individualized explanations for certain forms of content moderation?
Florida law is ensuring that individualized explanations are given within certain reasoning. As we mentioned in the last question, the Florida law does not require individualized explanations for anything obscene as it defines, right? So that means that if something is blatantly vulgar or illegal in any way, they of course have every right to remove that comment and censor it. However, for any other reason besides that, they need to give a thorough explanation for why they decided to ban the person. And if they do not comply with this, there are a number of repercussions that the company could face. For instance, there's I think a $100,000 fee that the company would have to handle, damages.
Why did Florida enact its social media law?
Why Florida enacted social media law was to protect first right Americans, stop big tech censorship. Ron DeSantis had said it himself that this Florida law was ensured to protect Republicans and protect their viewpoints and viewpoint discrimination on social media. Essentially, stop big tech censorship and stop these companies from abusing the Americans' rights.
So the at least perceived idea behind this law is to prevent right-wing viewpoints from being censored by the supposed left-wing Silicon Valley tech giants. And whether you agree with the idea that these Silicon Valley tech giants exist and are completely against the right wing, it's still extremely important that the freedom of speech of people on social media are protected, regardless of which viewpoint is being discriminated against. The fact is that social media platforms should not be allowed to ban and censor people on their platforms without any viable reason, because without providing a viable reason, it makes it such that the social media platform can ban their users for whatever they want. The point of this is to ensure that this censorship isn't just being done without reason, because if a reason is not being provided, then it could be for whatever motive that the social media company may have to censor speech. This ensures that it's being done for a purpose that is just for the role of a healthy environment on social media. Now, the point of this is to ensure that social media companies aren't just banning their users without any reasoning. Without providing a reason for banning their users or censoring them in any way, social media platforms could have any motive that they want, really. And by letting them just censor their users for whatever reason that they please without holding them accountable, we make it so that they can very easily censor people based on their viewpoints rather than reasoning that's completely necessary, such as if they post anything obscene or vulgar or illegal.
Yeah, and essentially, if social media companies are allowed to ban or mute users for whatever they want, it essentially becomes an online dictatorship, to the point where social media companies it's pretty much a given that social media companies have a monopoly over the digital marketplace of ideas. So once they have that, they have the ability to regulate and to silence users for whatever reason they want. It essentially becomes an online dictatorship. Like if the government were if the government were to discriminate against if the government were to discriminate against people's viewpoints if the government were to discriminate against people based off of their viewpoints in public spaces like parks or public libraries or public facilities, then this would immediately be a clear case, because the government simply cannot abridge on the First Amendment rights of Americans. And simply put, the same thing is happening on the online space, where these social media companies who have a monopoly over the digital marketplace of ideas are abusing the First Amendment rights of people, which is clearly why this Florida law should remain.
What tier of scrutiny should the court review Florida's law with?
So we urge this court to review this case with intermediate scrutiny. Now, intermediate scrutiny is just when there's at least a perceived violation of any protected entity, right? And in this case, there is a perceived transgression against social media platforms' right to speech in the form of their censorship. Now, I would like to point out how, while social media companies are private companies and therefore have certain protections under the Constitution, I think it's important to clarify that social media platforms do have protected speech, but in this case, they're not exercising that speech. Thus, this law does not, in fact, violate the First Amendment, because the social media platforms are not engaging in speech or conduct when they are censoring their users. And so, while we do urge the court to review this with intermediate scrutiny, the Florida side still wins on it.
Yeah, essentially pretty much obvious that the center of like this case is whether the social media companies are exercising editorial discretion and whether they're exercising their right to speech in this situation. So clearly it's going to be intermediate scrutiny because that's the main topic. That's what intermediate scrutiny is where it should be applied. But however, obviously we're arguing that they do not exercise their editorial discretion at this point, and they do not exercise their right to speech in this portion.
Do social media platforms resemble newspapers, which can control their editorial content?
So clearly, social media platforms do not resemble newspapers, do not control their editorial content. This is for two main reasons. One, Section 230, and then two, precedent shown in Gonzalez versus Google. So essentially, the Section 230 part is that Section 230 essentially said that social media companies are not held responsible for the posts that are found on their platforms. This means that essentially social media, when a user makes a post, that post is not the opinion of these social media companies. This is not the opinion of social media companies. These social media companies are not exercising their right to speech. Now, in terms of editorial discretion, editorial content, when social media companies ban these users or mute these users based off of their content, they're still not exercising editorial discretion, because if they were exercising editorial discretion, they would be held responsible for their content. In the same way that newspapers, since they exercise editorial discretion and since they are able to control and they produce their own content on their own platforms, newspapers are held liable for what is posted and for what is said in their columns. So in the same way, if social media companies exercise editorial discretion, it would be a clear logical link chain to say that social media companies would be responsible for what is held on their platforms, which they are not. Now the second part is Gonzalez versus Google. Essentially what Gonzalez versus Google is saying is that Google was arguing that it should not be held responsible for part of the 2015 Paris terrorist attack. Essentially what happens is Gonzalez sued Google because Gonzalez found that Google aided and abetted in international terrorism when Google allowed terrorists to use their platform. Essentially, Google argued that it was not responsible for the content on its platform because it did not exercise editorial discretion. So therefore, these companies do not exercise editorial discretion. They're not responsible for their content. So clearly they do not exercise editorial control if they're not responsible for the content on their platforms.
Does the compelled speech doctrine protect the rights of social media companies?
Social media companies are not protected by the compelled speech doctrine. And this is because when they censor user-generated content or use any kind of algorithm to prioritize certain content, this is not a form of speech or expression. As we've shown in Section 230 and in Gonzalez versus Google, one, social media companies are not held responsible for the content posted by users on their site, and therefore they are not allowed to edit it, as they're not claiming it as their own content and are not being held accountable by the law for the content on their sites.
Essential compelled speech doctrine does not protect the rights of social media companies because they're not actually exercising their right to speech. The whole point is that social media companies do not speak when they're censoring people, essentially because of, as my partner said, Section 230 and Gonzalez versus Google, where in both is clearly seen that social media companies do not exercise editorial discretion because they're not held accountable for the posts on their content. So far as they're not held accountable for the posts on their platforms, then they're not exercising speech because that's not their opinion. That's not like the official speech of these platforms. So they're not even to the point where they're not exercising speech. Then they're not. The compelled speech doctrine does not protect them. I was going to say something else, but all right, that's probably enough.
All right.
Do the social media platforms engage in commercial speech?
Social media platforms do not engage in commercial speech. by censoring their users, and that's because this is simply not speech at all. Now, if you look at precedent of this court in Biden v. Knight, some social media platforms are considered common carriers. And what that means is that social media platforms are really pushing the user-generated content forward to where it can be seen by other people. And they're not actually expressing the user-generated content. More so, they're just acting as a mediator between the person generating the content and whoever is going to see it on their platforms. Additionally, as we've said in these questions, social media platforms are not held accountable for user-generated content, and thus they cannot edit the content that is seen on their sites. So, second is that social media platforms are not held accountable for the user-generated content on their sites. What this means is that the content on their sites that is generated by their users is not considered their own. We've given precedent of Gonzalez versus Google, where a terrorist organization used Google, and in a trial against Google ended up winning the trial based on the idea that Google is not held responsible for the content generated by the terrorists on its site.
So essentially, just to summarize what my partner said, social media companies do not engage in speech at all. In fact, the people engaged in speech in this situation are the users. Public communications invoke the three core parts of the First Amendment: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of association, essentially, where you must protect the freedom of speech of Americans on social media. You must protect the freedom of the press associations on social media, freedom of association on social media as well. So essentially, that users are the ones who are speaking in this situation, and since the users are the ones who are speaking in this situation, then it's crucial that we protect the users' rights under the First Amendment on these social media platforms.
Will the Florida law increase or decrease free speech on social media?
The Florida law will clearly not decrease speech on social media, it will increase free speech on social media. It's protecting the First Amendment rights of all American citizens, regardless of their views. What social media companies are doing on these platforms is they're censoring the Americans' viewpoints based off of their beliefs, which is clearly a violation of the First Amendment. So when you're protecting free speech on social media, and you're protecting Americans' viewpoints on social media, you're increasing free speech because you're allowing more viewpoints, you're allowing more diverse ideas, you're allowing Americans to come out in these public forums to communicate with other Americans, to collaborate with ideas, to engage in dialogue, which is critical to the fabric of democracy. If Americans didn't engage in dialogue, they didn't engage in discussion, collaborate ideas, the fabric of democracy would be ruined. So since we're protecting democracy, we're protecting the First Amendment rights of these citizens on social media.
The Florida law will only increase free speech on social media. What it's doing is it's preventing these social media platforms from limiting what their users can see and limiting the expression of the opinions of their users. By enforcing individualized explanation requirements, the Florida law makes it so that the social media platforms will have to give adequate reasoning as to why they ban users. This means that they can't just say, well, we banned this user because he had an opinion that we disagreed with. And as my partner said, this is crucial to the fabric of democracy. As social media platforms become increasingly important with an increasingly digitalized world, we need to prioritize free speech on social media, and by enacting this Florida law, we protect the speech of social media users.
Does the Florida law create a slippery slope towards censorship?
No, the Florida law clearly does not create a slippery slope towards censorship. In fact, it does the opposite, because the Florida law is protecting First Amendment rights of American citizens, and it's stopping social media censorship on their platforms. So we're protecting First Amendment rights of Americans on platforms. We're decreasing censorship on social media platforms, so we're going to see an increase in democracy, an increase in free speech. So we are essentially not creating more censorship on social media platforms because we're allowing more diverse views, more diverse viewpoints on these social media platforms, which leads to an increase in free speech.
Florida law does not create a slippery slope towards censorship. This is because the government is not actually limiting the speech of these social media platforms, because social media platforms censoring their users is not speech. And so by limiting their censorship in any way, they are not actually limiting speech, and they're not censoring anyone. The only censoring that would be occurring is if this law was struck down, in which case social media platforms would be allowed to censor users for whatever reason they like, limit the expression of opinions on social media, and overall not only prevent people from expressing their opinions and allowing varied viewpoints, which is extremely important to democracy, but also prevent the people who use these social media platforms from being exposed to different viewpoints, which is equally important to democracy.